In the heart of a small Midwestern town in 1998, two young boys found themselves paired together for a class project, one from the east side of the tracks, one from the west. They couldn't have been more different on the surface, but what unfolded over the next 20 years would challenge not just their own preconceptions, but those of an entire community. Michael sat nervously at his desk that September morning, watching as Mrs. Peterson assigned partners for the history presentation. When she called his name alongside Chris's, his stomach did a small flip. They had never spoken before, despite sharing classes since elementary school. Their worlds simply didn't intersect. Different neighborhoods, different lunch tables, different lives altogether. Great, Michael remembers thinking, this is going to be awkward. But sometimes, life's most beautiful friendships bloom from moments of discomfort. As they began researching their topic, the civil rights movement, both boys discovered something unexpected. They shared the same dry sense of humor, the same passion for basketball, and the same dream of becoming architects. What started as after-school study sessions at the local library gradually transformed into shooting hoops at the community center, sharing family dinners, and becoming fixtures at each other's houses. Their friendship raised eyebrows at first. This was the late 90s in a town where certain unspoken boundaries had existed for generations. But there was something pure about their connection that made people pause and reconsider their own biases. My grandma used to say that friendship doesn't see color, it sees character. Chris shared years later, his voice thick with emotion. But living that truth, especially as kids, taught us both that breaking down barriers takes courage, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply sit next to someone different from you and say hello. Their bond would be tested during their high school years, when tensions in their town reached a breaking point over a controversial local election. Families who had lived as neighbors for decades suddenly found themselves divided along racial lines. But Michael and Chris refused to let their friendship become another casualty of adult prejudices. Instead, they did something remarkable. Using their shared passion for architecture and community building, they started a youth program at their high school called Building Bridges, where students from different backgrounds worked together to design and create projects for their town. What began as two teenagers refusing to let society dictate their friendship grew into a movement that would eventually change their community's fabric. The program's first project was ambitious, renovating an abandoned community center that had once served as a segregated facility decades ago. As they worked side by side with other students, transforming the space into something new while honoring its complex history, Michael and Chris discovered that their friendship had become something bigger than themselves. It had become a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of looking past superficial differences to see the humanity in each other. But their story was far from over. As graduation approached, a devastating event would shake their town to its core, forcing everyone to confront their deepest held beliefs about race, friendship, and community. Michael and Chris would find themselves at the center of a storm that would either tear their friendship apart or prove that true bonds can weather any challenge. Their tale is more than just a story about two friends from different backgrounds. It's a mirror reflecting our own capacity for growth, understanding, and genuine connection in a world that often seems determined to keep us apart. As we delve deeper into their journey, we'll discover how their unwavering friendship didn't just change their lives, but created ripples that would transform an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly see each other as human beings first. The devastating event came in the form of a fire that ripped through the newly renovated community center one crisp autumn evening, just weeks before its grand reopening. The blaze left behind more than just charred walls and melted windows. It ignited a powder keg of accusations and suspicions that had been simmering beneath the town's surface for years. Some whispered that it was no accident, pointing fingers at those who had opposed the center's integration from the start. Others suggested it was just faulty wiring in the old building. But for Michael and Chris, who had poured their hearts into the renovation alongside dozens of other students, the loss felt deeply personal. They had spent countless weekends painting walls, installing new floors, and creating a space that represented their vision of unity. I remember standing there watching the firefighters work, and Chris just grabbed my shoulder. Michael recalls, his voice still carrying the weight of that moment. We didn't need words. We both knew this wasn't going to break us. It was going to make us stronger. That night, as the embers still glowed, they made a pact that would set the course for their entire senior year. Instead of letting the fire divide their community further, they turned it into a rallying cry. The next morning, Chris stood up during the school assembly, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by a passionate determination. This center wasn't just a building, he declared to the packed auditorium. It was proof that when we come together, we can build something beautiful. And if it takes us building it twice, then that's exactly what we'll do. The response was unprecedented. Students who had never spoken to each other began working side by side. Parents who had opposed the original renovation wrote checks to support the rebuild. Local businesses donated materials and supplies. But more importantly, people started talking, really talking, about the invisible lines that had divided their town for generations. During one particularly tense town hall meeting, Michael's grandfather, a respected elder in the community, stood up and shared a story he'd never told before. He spoke about his own friendship with Chris's grandfather back in the 1960s, a friendship they had to keep hidden because of the times they lived in. "We're not living in that world anymore," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "And shame on us if we let fear and ignorance rob another generation of the chance to know each other as human beings." The investigation into the fire continued, casting a shadow over the rebuilding efforts. Rumors and theories circulated through the town like autumn leaves in the wind. But something remarkable was happening alongside the uncertainty. The very act of coming together to rebuild was slowly rebuilding the community itself. Michael and Chris found themselves at the center of this transformation, though not always comfortably. There were still those who saw their friendship as a threat to the status quo, who tried to pressure them to stick with their own kind. Anonymous notes appeared in their lockers. Whispered comments followed them through the halls, yet each act of resistance only strengthened their resolve. As winter settled over the town, the new community center began taking shape, but beneath the surface of progress, tensions continued to simmer. The police investigation was narrowing its focus, and the truth about the fire threatened to shatter the fragile peace that had formed around the rebuilding efforts. Michael and Chris discovered information that could implicate someone close to them, forcing them to confront an impossible choice: protect the person they cared about or stand up for the truth they believed in. The truth hit them like a sledgehammer one snowy December afternoon. While sorting through old photographs for the community center's memorial wall, Chris discovered a familiar face in a yellowed newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. It was Michael's Uncle Robert, standing proudly in front of the original community center during its first integration attempt in the late 1970s. The same uncle who had been suspiciously vocal against the renovation project from the start. "Sometimes the hardest truth is the one closest to home," Michael whispered, his hands trembling as he held the photograph. The pieces started falling into pieces. The late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings, the way Uncle Robert always seemed to know details about the renovation that weren't public knowledge. But proving it was another matter entirely. The investigation had stalled, and without concrete evidence, they risked tearing their families apart over what might be just suspicions. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on them like the heavy winter snow blanketing their town. The rebuilding project continued, with the grand reopening scheduled for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. As the date approached, the pressure mounted. Anonymous threatening letters began appearing at both their homes, warning them to let sleeping dogs lie. Their families noticed their changed behavior, the whispered conversations, the worried glances. "We're not just protecting a building anymore," Chris told Michael one evening as they sat in their favorite spot at the local diner. "We're fighting for everything we believe in." The waitress who had served them countless milkshakes over the years watched from behind the counter, seeing not two teenagers but two young men carrying the weight of their community's future on their shoulders. The situation reached a boiling point during the final town council meeting before the reopening. Uncle Robert stood up to speak against the project one last time, his words dripping with barely concealed hatred. But as he spoke, Michael noticed something in his uncle's jacket pocket, a familiar-looking lighter, one he'd seen on the day of the fire. That night, both families gathered for what was supposed to be a casual dinner, a tradition they'd maintained despite the growing tensions. The air was thick with unspoken words and hidden truths. Michael's mother kept glancing between her son and her brother, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface of polite conversation. Chris watched his best friend struggling with the burden of knowledge, seeing the toll it was taking on him. They had dreamed of building bridges, but now faced the prospect of burning one that could never be rebuilt. The choice before them seemed impossible: protect family or protect justice. As the adults discussed the upcoming reopening ceremony, Uncle Robert made a seemingly innocent comment about history having a way of repeating itself. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Michael felt something snap inside him. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Some history shouldn't repeat itself," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Chris stood up too, shoulder to shoulder with his friend, just as they had been since that first day in history class. The moment stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to either snap or sing. The truth was about to come out, for better or worse, and nothing would ever be the same again. The real test of their friendship and their community was about to begin, as the shadows of the past threatened to darken their hopes for the future. Just as Michael opened his mouth to confront his uncle with the truth, Chris's grandmother burst into the room, clutching a stack of old letters in her trembling hands. "Before anyone says something they can't take back," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "there's something you all need to know about the original community center." The letters, yellowed with age, revealed a shocking truth that no one had seen coming. Uncle Robert hadn't always been against integration. In fact, he had once been its strongest supporter. The letters, exchanged between him and Chris's grandfather in the 1970s, told a story of two best friends working together to create the original integrated community center. But a tragic incident had twisted Robert's heart, turning his passion for unity into bitter resentment. "Your father died trying to save that building." Robert's voice cracked as he addressed Chris, tears forming in his eyes for the first time anyone could remember. The night of the fire in '79, he went back in to get the integration documents, to prove we had the right to be there. I was supposed to go with him, but I was too scared. The room fell into a heavy silence as the implications of this revelation sank in. Chris stood frozen, learning for the first time how his father had really died. All these years, his family had simply said it was an accident. Michael looked at his uncle with new eyes, seeing not a hateful man, but a broken one who had carried the weight of guilt for over 40 years. But the twists weren't over. As Robert broke down, he revealed something even more startling. He hadn't set the recent fire, but he knew who did. Someone else had discovered the old letters and was using the painful history to manipulate them, threatening to expose his past cowardice unless he opposed the new renovation. "It's someone on the city council," Robert whispered, pulling out his phone to show them threatening text messages. "Someone who stands to lose everything if this community truly comes together. They've been playing us all against each other for years." The dinner table had become a battlefield of emotions: shock, anger, grief, and hope all swirling together. Chris's grandmother reached across the table and took Robert's hand, an act of forgiveness that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Your father would be proud of you both," she said, looking at Chris and Michael. "But this fight isn't over yet." She was right. With less than a week until the reopening ceremony, they now faced an even bigger challenge. Someone powerful was actively working to keep their community divided, using the ghosts of the past as weapons. The fire wasn't just an act of hatred. It was part of a larger plan. Michael and Chris exchanged glances, their earlier confrontation forgotten in the face of this new revelation. They had started this journey thinking they were just two friends trying to build a community center. Now they found themselves at the center of a decades-old web of secrets, lies, and redemption. As the snow continued falling outside, casting the world in a quiet blanket of white, the two families began piecing together clues from the past and present. But time was running out. The person behind it all was still out there, likely planning their next move. And with the reopening ceremony approaching, they knew one thing for certain: this story was about to reach its breaking point. The reopening ceremony dawned bright and cold, with hundreds of community members gathering despite the bitter January wind. As Michael and Chris helped set up the podium, they noticed Council Member Richardson watching them intently from his car across the street. The same council member who had mysteriously pushed for budget cuts in certain neighborhoods for years. The same man who had fought against the original integration decades ago. Thanks to Uncle Robert's old letters and some late-night research, they had discovered Richardson's family once owned the land where the community center stood. Hidden in the county records was a forgotten clause. If the property ever fell into disuse, ownership would revert to the original family. The fire wasn't just about division. It was about real estate and power. But they had a plan. As Richardson approached the podium to give his speech, Chris's grandmother stood up from her seat in the front row. "Before we begin," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd, "I think it's time we share something with everyone." She held up a USB drive containing security footage from the night of the fire, footage that Richardson didn't know existed. The councilman's face went pale. Uncle Robert had installed additional cameras after receiving the threatening messages, cameras that caught a familiar figure entering the building late that night. But what happened next surprised everyone. Richardson's own teenage daughter stepped forward from the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, I saw you that night," she said, her voice shaking. "I followed you because I was worried about how angry you've been. I saw everything, and I can't stay quiet anymore." The crowd murmured as she continued, "But what you don't know is that I went back in after you left. I'm the reason the fire didn't spread to the historical documents room. I couldn't let you destroy everything these people worked for." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Richardson's daughter had secretly been attending the youth programs at the center, seeing firsthand how it was changing lives. Her act of courage that night had preserved crucial evidence of the center's original integration mission, evidence that now legally protected its status forever. As police officers stepped forward from the crowd, Richardson made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "This was my family's legacy," he shouted. "We built this town." But his words were drowned out by the sound of his daughter's footsteps as she walked across the stage to stand between Michael and Chris. "No," she said firmly. "They built this town. All of them. Together." The crowd erupted in applause as Richardson was led away, his decades of manipulation finally exposed. But the real surprise came during Uncle Robert's speech. As he shared his story of friendship and loss, he revealed one final truth. Chris's father hadn't died in vain that night in '79. The documents he saved had been hidden in the walls of the old building, discovered during the renovation. They didn't just prove the center's right to exist. They contained signatures from every family in town, including the Richardsons, supporting integration. "Sometimes," Robert said, looking out at the diverse crowd before him, "we have to tear down walls to find the truth. And sometimes that truth shows us that we were never really divided at all." As the ceremony concluded, Michael and Chris stood with their families, no longer separated by guilt, fear, or misunderstanding. The community center's doors opened again, not just as a building, but as a symbol of healing decades in the making. And as people filed in, crossing boundaries that had once seemed permanent, they proved what Michael and Chris had known all along, that the strongest bridges are built not of steel and stone, but of understanding and forgiveness. Today, 5 years later, the community center stands as a beacon of hope in our town. Its walls, once scared by fire and hatred, now showcase photographs spanning generations, images of friendship that transcended boundaries, including a prominent display of Chris's father and Uncle Robert in their younger days, standing proud and united. Richardson's daughter, Sarah, became an integral part of the center's youth leadership program. Her courage in standing up to her father inspired a new generation to speak truth to power. After serving his sentence, Richardson found his own path to redemption, working with local youth to share his story as a cautionary tale about the poison of prejudice and greed. Uncle Robert found peace in mentoring young people at the center, sharing his experiences and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. "Every day I walk through these doors," he often says, "I feel my old friend walking beside me, proud of what his son and this community have built." The Building Bridges program that Michael and Chris started in high school has expanded to neighboring towns, creating a network of young people dedicated to breaking down barriers. Their story has become a catalyst for change, proving that friendship can indeed be stronger than fear. Chris followed his dream of becoming an architect, designing community spaces that bring people together. His first major project? Expanding the very center where his father's legacy lives on. Michael pursued urban planning, working to ensure that development serves all members of the community equally. Together, they continue to build both literal and figurative bridges. But perhaps the most profound change can be seen in the small, everyday moments. The lunch tables in the local high school no longer have invisible lines dividing them. The annual town festival, once practically segregated by unspoken rules, now feels like a true celebration of their shared community. Children play together in the center's playground, blissfully unaware that their friendships were once considered controversial. The real measure of change, Chris's grandmother often reminds visitors to the center, isn't in the big moments everyone remembers. It's in the small ones we used to think were impossible. She points to a wall of photographs showing these everyday victories, students of all backgrounds studying together, families sharing meals, seniors teaching young people traditional crafts from various cultures. The old newspaper clipping that started their investigation now hangs in a special place, alongside the integration documents that Chris's father died protecting. Below them, a simple plaque reads, "The past is not just something to remember, it's something to learn from." Michael and Chris still meet at their old booth in the diner, now as young men rather than uncertain teenagers. They talk about their plans, their dreams, and sometimes about that pivotal year when they learned that true friendship can change not just two lives, but an entire community. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Michael said recently, stirring his coffee. "How close we came to letting fear win. How easy it would have been to stay on our separate sides of town." Chris smiled, looking out the window at the community center across the street, its doors open wide, people of all backgrounds flowing in and out. "But that's not who we are," he replied. "Not anymore." And there, in that simple truth, lies the heart of their story, a tale not just about building bridges, but about the courage it takes to cross them. A reminder that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the hardest moments, and that true friendship isn't about ignoring our differences. It's about celebrating them, learning from them, and growing stronger together because of them.